Hello, everyone. Welcome to the continuation of our series on building programs that last. Today, we're going to talk implementation planning. Before we get too far into content today, of course, we're going to start with our standard disclaimer. This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred. So now that we've got that out of the way, we'll go ahead and acknowledge all of the wonderful people that are involved in making sure that our grants are thriving. And so I'd like to just acknowledge the Office of Indian Education team. And today, you have two facilitators for this recorded webinar, myself, Casey Morgan, and Alani. Hi, Alani.
Hi, Casey.
And we are so excited to dive into today's objectives with you. So, our goals today are to understand what makes a strong implementation plan, to explore how to move from strategy to action, and to learn how to move from strategy selection into action and discuss program monitoring. And so, we'll review those components of program monitoring as well. Before we jump in, just a reminder that we always need to think with the end in mind. So, what are those things that we need to do at the end of the year or at the end of an activity? You really want to backwards design from there. So, you want to always think about how you're evaluating a program or activity, and always think about how you can tell your story through the data you collect, and always think about your APR submission as well. So, what are you going to add to your explanation of progress sections? What other ways can you share data and garner support for your program or expand the reach of your program and your ideas? Are you collecting the right data to report on your project measures or to share your work? Are you collecting information on your GEPRA measures? You always want to make sure you include those as well. And so it's much easier to make sure that we have all of these different pieces and moving parts if we're really thinking with these end things in mind at the front end. And then that way you don't get all the way to the end and say, oh no, I wasn't collecting this piece of data, or I'm not really sure how well we're doing in this area. And then having to try and backtrack and figure out how to make an assessment of your progress in that area or figure out how to word your progress to people. So these are important questions you should be thinking about all throughout the year. During our last session, we reviewed real world examples of choosing an evidence based activity or program. And in that webinar, we really dug into work based learning specifically and choosing activities in that area. So we walked through the definition of work based learning, the components, and gave some examples that different states are using in this space. So work based learning is more than just internships or job shadowing, it's really also exposure and awareness of different career paths and potential future aspirations. It's a powerful approach to connecting students learning with real world careers and local values. So when implemented well, work-based learning builds not only skills, but also an integrated identity, agency, and aspirations. So work-based learning makes for a great activity or program in terms of addressing those local needs that you might have identified. And then today, we're moving to our next step in building sustainable programs, implementation planning. So implementation is the bridge between planning and impact. You'll see here that in the continuous improvement cycle, we're kind of in these two areas or straddling these two areas, planning for implementation and implementing. Because when you plan for implementation, obviously, like we said at the beginning, you kind of have to have the end in mind or the next pieces and steps in mind and a vision for that as well. So many of you are familiar with that continuous improvement cycle. And today, like I said, we're zeroing in on implementation, which is where rubber meets the road. So this is a stage where plans turn into programs and we begin to see impact. But how we implement and how we involve the community in that implementation and in planning for that implementation makes all the difference. Mm-hmm. So implementation planning takes your strategies and it turns them into coordinated action. It's where you define the how. So you might have picked a program or an activity that you want to implement, for instance, work-based learning. But then this is really getting into what does it look like to actually implement those things? What does it look like to actually do internships, to actually have some type of career exploration integrated into content areas or advisory or other parts of the day? And that takes a lot of planning and a lot of asking very specific and targeted questions to really think about what the actions look like step by step in order for you to get to that program that you have decided on in terms of addressing those local needs. So that how that includes roles, it includes timelines, supports, and tools for keeping things on track. And it's also your opportunity to ensure that the work is aligned with your community's strengths and culture. So even if we've chosen work-based learning, we want to make sure, like we said earlier, that can be so many different things. It can be implemented in different ways. It can look very different. And all of those different ways of implementing a work-based learning activity or program are valid. And you want to make sure that you're not just kind of dumping everything in the bucket and seeing what works in the moment without pre-planning. You really want to think about how do we build something that really speaks to our community and the needs of our community and its existing strengths, rather than just kind of like copying, pasting something or throwing something together or doing a whole bunch of things without that real intentional planning piece happening. So these are a couple of questions specifically that you want to ask yourself that will help you with identifying those roles, timelines, supports, and tools. We have who is doing what, when will it happen, what support is needed, and how will we track progress. And then there are a few key elements of a strong implementation plan. And so these are the essential building blocks of a solid implementation plan here that you see on the screen. When each of these pieces is in place, it helps your team stay organized and be responsive to those continually evolving local needs that may pop up. As you know, this is a cycle, so we're constantly moving through it. It's constantly ebbing and flowing. But this creates a clear path forward for everyone involved that then you can adapt as you move along. And so all these people involved might include work-based learning coordinators, campus coordinators or other types of coordinators, classroom teachers, families, administrators, and so on. And so the first element of a strong implementation plan is clear goals. And so you want to make sure that the goals that you have around the activity or practice that you're implementing are really aligned to your grant priorities and your local needs. Like we said earlier, if you're thinking with the end in mind, you know that you have to share and report on these things at the end of the year. And so if all of the decisions that you're making and all of the experiences that you're designing for your users are very disconnected from your grant priorities or your local needs, it's going to be hard to tell that story in your community and outside of it. And you want to be able to do both. The second element is defined roles. So you want to have clarity on who's responsible for what, both in terms of the on-the-ground implementation and when it comes down to those pieces like monitoring progress or engaging community and family that help make that on-the-ground implementation stronger as well. It's really hard when you have multiple people kind of trying to do the same thing or overlapping each other, coming behind each other, or when nothing is getting done because everyone's kind of like, oh, I'm not really sure what role I play in this. I'm not really sure what part is mine. And on that, you also want to make sure that everyone has a role so that there's this shared responsibility across the team as well. So even families and community members, you want to think about what role can they play to support the implementation as well and be really clear with them about how they can support because a lot of times even those people they kind of get left to the side and forgotten about when we're in the school or in the system and really trying to think about what the day-to-day looks like and sometimes they want to be involved or they want to support and they want to know how to help and that's just not always clear or timely in terms of communication. Then third, we have timelines and milestones. And so with timelines and milestones, you want to make sure that you're setting achievable checkpoints. So in the past, we've talked about like what are those pieces along the river? What are those landmarks that help us know where we're at and how far we have to go? And so that's kind of what we're getting at here as well is what are those landmarks along the way as you're implementing that lets you know like, hey, let's stop and let's check on where we're at. Let's see what progress is being made, potentially adapt as well. Then fourth, we have resources and training. You want to ensure that staff are supported. You also want to ensure that anyone that's playing a role is supported. So if you're trying something new with your kids, you want to make sure that the kids understand what role they play and how things might shift and are supported through that shift as well. You want to make sure that families feel equipped to support at home or to come into the school and support when that's appropriate. And then on that note as well, that leads into our fifth key element, which is community and family engagement. So keeping families and stakeholders informed and engaged in what's going on. You really want to have a collaborative implementation plan. You want it to be designed that way because you can go farther if you have a lot of people, working towards a coordinated effort than a lot of people that are sort of disjointed, or if you only have like one or two people that are really working towards a specific program or activity and building that out. And then last but not least, we have monitoring progress. And so that's tracking your progress along the way and then making those adjustments. So all of those things before monitoring progress really should inform that monitoring of progress as well. So you have those timelines and milestones, you have resources and training, community and family engagement. All of those pieces kind of lead into monitoring progress and help you to close that loop and continue through implementation and the rest of the continuous improvement process as well. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Olani to help us dive even deeper into each of these pieces.
Thanks, Casey. Let's move on to clear goals. Again, Casey did a great job about providing an overview, but we're going to dig a little bit deeper. And so your goals are really the foundation of your implementation plan. They help your team, your community, and your funders even to understand where you're moving your program and what you're working towards. Using SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, really helps you keep focused and accountable. Think of your goal as like your North Star, guiding all implementation decisions. As you write your goals, you want to maybe ask yourself, does this reflect the voices of our community and the values we want to uphold and the needs that our community has identified as being priority? And so here's a couple of examples of some SMART goals. You can see we put time bound right up in front where we have the time in which we will accomplish this goal. And then also we put in measures. So you can see there the 80% to 95% in the first example, as well as the 90% of teacher candidates and 75% Native students. That's a qualifier. So making sure it's measurable. And then, of course, for yourself and your own organization, identifying if it is actually achievable given the, the resources you need for this program, the capacity within your organization to provide this program, as well as also within the time frame that you are proposing for this SMART goal. Now, SMART goals are really important. You can also use SMART for your objectives as well, to really provide a sound basis and something that you can measure against. Let's move on to define roles. And so, why are we defining roles? And it just doesn't, most of the time we think about efficiency, but it also builds a shared sense of purpose. It helps to provide clarity and support sustainability. And, really in the long run, when you talk about sustainability, it helps to prevent burnout. In many communities, leadership often shows up in many forms. We have formal, relational, and intergenerational. We want to make space for all those types of roles. An educator might not be a full-time employee, but their contribution could be central to the progress of to the program's success. And so you want to take all those things into consideration. And one of the ways you can provide clarity is really assigning clear responsibilities to staff as well as partners. When you bring on partners, you may want to consider an MOU, even volunteers, having position description and responsibilities very clear for volunteers as well. Include community leaders, youth mentors, elders, and volunteers in as you define roles. Use a who, what, when, how structure for each role, which really helps you, again, provide clarity for yourself, making sure all your bases are covered in the implementation of your program, but also for the people who are assisting you. This defined roles can really help to create an environment that has shared decision making. It can allow you to be flexible and to adapt, and also show respect for both formal and informal leadership. Again, when I'm talking about like some of the informal, maybe volunteers who are stepping up to take over maybe transportation issues for students getting to their work-based learning sites. Those are critical people that you want to make sure that the entire organization, even though they're not getting paid, respects them and respects how they are contributing to the success of your program. After doing all of that, what you really want to look at is timelines and milestones. Again, connected back to your goal statement. A strong timeline helps you to avoid last-minute scrambles and supports. It also provides thoughtful pacing of the program. When developing your timeline, you want to check for any bottlenecks. Like do several major tasks, all rely on the same person or the same resource. Can you spread it out a little to sort of spread out the work, even if it's spreading out the work or spreading out the time in which that work can be accomplished? Also, timelines should include community events or seasonal consideration, like gatherings or maybe even some activities that happen within particular seasons. One of the key things around milestone planning is you really want to break down your activities into monthly or quarterly steps, include deadlines and completion dates, and think about when you're doing those milestones, what needs to happen first before something can be completed or before the next task can be completed. And that's what we call dependencies. And so, for example, before I can register students to participate in my work-based learning, I need to make sure they have the actual registration form, and maybe I might have even had to do outreach. And so those are things that need to happen before I can actually register students for the class. And so those are what we would consider dependencies. Also, what is really important is to build in review points for reflection and feedback. Not only do you want to build in review points, but you want to sort of normalize that function into your operations. And so whether it's a regular, gets sort of folded into regular team meetings or staff meetings or community meetings or partnership meetings, you want to make sure at all those different levels you are providing time for feedback and in order to improve the program. Some of the tools you can use in order to create timelines are Gantt charts, program calendars, as well as task tracking systems such as Excel, Google Sheets, sorry, and Trello. Those are some of the resources that you may want to use to help in your keys. But then, one of the big things is in order to implement a program is to have the resources handy and the training of some maybe human resources to be able to provide and implement the program. And so, implementation is only as strong as the people that are delivering it. We want to make sure that staff are equipped and confident. Training should be held to go beyond just logistics. And it should include community values, protocols, and pedagogies that are rooted in the systems of community. And also, you don't want to forget to plan for onboarding as well as turnover. It's a reality. And so that's something you're going to have to you should already sort of start planning for before it even happens. Here are some of the resources that I'm sure you have identified, whether they are human resources, talking about the people who will actually be implementing the program, materials. There's some examples, as well as financial resources and all the different types of financial resources that you're going to need, as well as cultural resources. Some of these can also be for cultural resources, having access to environments and practices and being able to get students out to those practices. And so really taking time to think up through all those things. And again, like I had mentioned earlier, staff development is always an important consideration, but I kind of want to extend it past just staff development as sort of like paid staff. Remember to also consider the development of your volunteers. Those are really important people that sometimes we just sort of we kind of forget about, but they need to have their capabilities and capacities built as well, and they need to and should be onboarded as well. Let's jump into community and family engagement. Implementation should never be something done to the community. Of course, I know most of our OIE, if not all, are like embedded in community and actively engaged with the community in both developing this program as well as implementing this program. Really bringing in youth, parents, elders, community leaders, companies, small businesses, large businesses, potentially even other funders to engage and create a really strong community and implementation plan. Some of the engagement strategies can be hosting talking circles, community dinners, or school visits. You always want to keep them engaged and connected through updates. You have all different types of ways in which to do that. A lot of us now are also using social media to provide updates to our community and our extended community. Of course, you can always use feedback tools, surveys, focus groups, and also storytelling. We want to think and have a consciousness about how we make space for elders, youth, and families to lead parts of the work of implementation. And so we'll move into the next slide, which has engagement types. And this is a continuum of the different types and ways in which you can engage people, moving from informing to consulting, involving, collaborating, and then empowering. Uh, this continuum really is a framework that helps us to understand how family and community engagement can evolve from informing to empowering. This continuum represents increasing levels of stakeholder influence, voice, and shared decision making. As we move from left to right, families and communities have more ownership, leadership, and power in shaping programs, policies, and outcomes. Let's just take a moment to sort of walk through these different stages of the continuum. Let's begin with informing. This is the starting point. This is when programs really provide updates, announcements, or resources to families and communities. It's a one-way communication with the program communicating to families and communities. It's important because this is where you start to build a transparency and relationship. But in terms of influence, it is very low on the scale of influence for family and community. As we move up the continuum, we come to consulting. This next area really begins to ask for input. A lot of us do that through surveys, interviews, or community forums. Families and community members have a chance to be heard, but decisions are still mostly made by the program staff or the organization. And then we move on to involving. And so here, families and community members are actively participating, helping with events, offering ideas, and serving on committees. They input and shape decisions through, though the final authority often still remains with the organization. And then we get to collaborating. And this is where true partnership begins. This is where families and community members co-create and co-lead initiatives. There's shared decision-making at this level and mutual accountability at this level as well. And then finally, we come to empowering. At this far end of the continuum, engagement becomes really transformative. Family and communities are leaders. They drive initiatives, they influence policy, and take ownership of the work. Some examples on this sort of like high end of both engagement and accountability is really when you think about school boards that are made up of primarily families, even some students, as well as community leaders, and really sort of represent the organization and are very connected and influential in all aspects of the program. When we look at monitoring progress, this is sort of the last step in those key elements of implementing. We really want to look at how we shift from planning to real-time awareness. We want to make sure that we are keeping our teams accountable and focused, and that's a little bit about what monitoring does. It also supports continuous learning and improvement. Again, connecting and identifying maybe gaps that we need to build some staff training around or some volunteering training around in order to always improve the program. It also helps us recognize what's working and adjust what is not working. You know, some of the key questions that can really help guide monitoring is, are activities being implemented as planned? You know, one of the ideas is really like looking at implementation fidelity. Are we doing exactly what we said we were going to do? Or have sometimes when you're in the implement phase, you're just sort of like running and you need again that review time to sort of look up and say like, Are we doing what we said we were going to do, or did we, in the implementing, adjust? And what were those adjustments? So even though maybe you passed the point of the adjustment, you want to make sure you're noting that in your review time of how and what you adjusted. The other question is, are we even meeting our milestones that we set forth? It's okay if you don't, but you should have a discussion and understand what are the reasons why you're not meeting the milestone. Maybe that milestone wasn't actually a milestone. Maybe it was just a speed bump and you need another milestone and need to create another milestone along the way. What evidence shows we're making progress? And so, what are the things that we're looking for that show progress? Now, at the beginning of implementation, maybe one of the progress points is that you have an outreach plan and you have registration forms that are being completed by students, and all of your number of students that you anticipated and you're planning to get have actually registered. So that's a great piece of evidence that shows that you're making progress. And then again, the really important question when it comes to monitoring is how are we adapting based on what we're learning? And so again, you don't want to continue to do things that aren't working, but also take into consideration through the monitoring progress what changes you're making and the adaptations that you're going through. Again, some tools and strategies that you can use are there: implementation logs or checklists, regular team check-ins, and reflection sessions. I want to put in a caveat that's not in the slide. One consideration is a lot of times when we're thinking about implementation, we're thinking about the program staff or the people who are involved in the delivery of services. This is a really great time to circle and loop in your fiscal and financial and budget people into this conversation, because your adjustments in program may affect your budget or vice versa. And so you want to have all of your team members at the table, and your fiscal and budget people are key people of that team. So always remember to include them as much as possible. You also have your data dashboards and scorecards or other tools. We're going to get into the future talking about how we can take all of this information we're collecting through the monitoring and evaluation progress and turn it into stories and community feedback. And then, of course, you want to document the adaptations and lessons learned. So you now have a full framework for moving from strategy to action. These are the 6 elements that you can use to really shape your program's next steps. The work ahead is important, and it is also deeply community driven. And I get to see all of the work that you folks are doing and see that connection. And your implementation plan is more than just paperwork. I know many of you have done implementation plans before and converted that into a grant application, or you've converted it into looking at maybe establishing your program or practices within your program as a promising practice. And so there are many ways in which this implementation plan becomes more than just paperwork. It really is a commitment to your program participants, your community, and the future of your community. So again, you want to look at drafting those SMART goals based on your selected strategies, identifying your core implementation team and their roles, building out a 12-month implementation timeline, which will include your milestones, developing a list of needed resources, training, which can then be converted into an actual program budget, mapping out your engagement plan to keep and looking at the different levels of engagement based on that continuum that you are able to achieve, and how engaged you want your families and communities to be. And then also, of course, set time aside intentionally and strategically to monitor and reflect on all of your hard work. That's a lot. I want to just leave you with this. I thought it was a great final thought. Go forward with courage. When you are in doubt, be still and wait. When doubt no longer exists for you, then go forward with courage. I think that pretty much sums up a great practice, something to definitely think about. I know maybe when you say, like, when you're in doubt, be still and wait, but in the still and waiting, you are also observing what's happening around you. And I know for many of you and being in many conversations with you, not only are you observing what's going on, but you're also assessing it as you go. And so when I think a lot of times when we sort of come to some conclusion, we gather people around and share that. And then together we can move forward in courage with a plan in our minds. And so I just want to again thank you for joining us today. I hope that this was helpful. Again, if you have any questions regarding your actual grant, you can contact your program officer at the Office of Indian Education. Or if you need any coaching or technical assistance, you can email us at oie@seiservices.com and put a coaching on your calendar. And we'd love to sort of work with you on any of these aspects that we shared. I want to again thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day. Aloha.